We'll get started in a little bit. We'll start in probably just another couple minutes. Okay, good evening. I'm going to go ahead and get started with some housekeeping remarks before we get into the run of show tonight. So just first off, let me introduce myself. My name is Ian McMillan, and I am an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer here in the Planning Division of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, South Coast AQMD. We're here tonight to talk about our 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. So before we get into all of that content, I do want to just run through some basic logistics for the evening on the Zoom format. So I'm just going to read through a little script here. So again, thank you for participating in our remote regional public hearing for the 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. We will do our best to facilitate a smooth meeting with public participation. We have two formats for participation, the Zoom web application as well as teleconference. Before we begin, I want to review some guidelines and general instructions for the meeting. For those on the panel, we ask you to please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone. This will ensure that we are not hearing any feedback or causing interruption during the meeting. This meeting is being translated in Spanish. To watch or listen to this meeting in the language of your choice, you must click on the globe icon labeled Interpretation at the bottom of your screen. From there, select the language of your choice. After you select your language, if you hear both languages at the same time, please click Mute Original Audio. For those participating by phone, if you wish to hear the meeting in Spanish, please use the phone number and meeting ID number posted on the agenda. All participants on Zoom, except for panelists, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each agenda item, after we get through all of the agenda items, we will move to public comment. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for public comment. We may provide a shorter length of time depending on the number of requests to speak that have been received and to allow everyone an opportunity to be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. If interpretation is needed, more time will be allotted. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment, on the Zoom screen, please click on the Raise Hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note, you can hang up and/or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. We ask you to please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. Finally, if there are any South Coast AQMD board members or their consultants who wish to be brought onto the panel, please raise your hands and we can bring you over. Okay, so that is the basic logistics for just how the Zoom meeting can run tonight. We have a lot of content and a lot of speakers I'm very excited to hear from tonight. This is I guess the third in a series of meetings we're holding on the air quality management plan. So we're going to be going through what's in that plan. We have some other items that we also wanted to share on the agenda today. That includes hearing from CARB on their state implementation plan strategy that they had recently adopted. We will also hear a brief summary of the environmental analysis for this air quality management plan. And then finally, a socioeconomic impact discussion of the impacts from this plan. So a lot of content to get through today. We have a number of speakers on each of these agenda items. I'm going to ask each speaker as they go through to just do a quick introduction for themselves, and then we'll defer all the introductions to that time. And again, we will get to public comment after we get through all of the content. I know it's going to take us a little bit to get there, but we do want to get through the content first, and then we definitely want to hear public feedback. That's the reason we're here. We think it's really crucial anytime we go through this planning process to hear from the public, hear the perspectives, because it really helps to guide everything that we do. So appreciate everybody's time away from their busy schedules tonight. With that, I can move on, and we're just going to go ahead into our first presentation. And this is going to be from Dr. Sang-Mi Lee to give an overview of the revised draft 2022 AQMP. And so with that, Sang-Mi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everybody. I am Sang-Mi Lee, Planning and Rules Manager working on AQMP development. So thank you, everybody, for participating in this regional public hearings. Next slide. As Ian mentioned, this is the third of the series. We scheduled 5 meetings in total, and this is the third one. As shown in this slide, there are 2 more meetings to be held tomorrow and day after tomorrow. Next slide. This is a brief outline of my presentation. So we'll touch base on background and air quality, and then based on future years' NOx emissions, and the control strategies proposed in this AQMP, and public process conducted to assist the development of the AQMP, and then what to expect as the next steps. Next slide. So we'll start my presentation who we are. So South Coast AQMD is a local air pollution control agency. We oversee the South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. We are the largest of all the local air pollution control agencies in the United States. Our primary responsibility is emission reductions from stationary sources, and we also develop a plan such as AQMP to make a strategy to improve air quality. Next slide. So Coachella Valley, as today's public hearing is targeted for, is the portion of Riverside County located in Salton Sea Air Basin. The solid black lines in the map on the right indicates the location and the shape of Coachella Valley. That is located downwind of South Coast Air Basin, and 2018 data indicated it has approximately 500,000 population and approximately 300,000 the vehicles. Next slide. So going into what this AQMP is, so the AQMP is a blueprint to improve air quality of the region, and the primary purpose is to meet the federal air quality standard. This 2022 AQMP is the latest of the series, and the reason is recently EPA revised the federal air quality standard. In 2015, more specifically, that the tightened ozone air quality to 70 ppb, ozone air quality standard to be 70 ppb. That triggers the need to develop an AQMP. Next slide. So our challenge is well demonstrated in these two photos. It is well known that Los Angeles Air Basin suffered from the poor ozone air quality. However, compared to half of a century ago, we have made a great improvement. Still, Los Angeles Air Basin or South Coast Air Basin has the worst ozone air quality in the entire nation, and then among the worst fine particulate air pollution in the nation. Next slide. So since today's meeting is targeting Coachella Valley, this is demonstrating ozone improvement in Coachella Valley. The 1 hour ozone standard, 1 hour ozone progress in red, and 8 hour ozone in blue lines. The federal air quality standard that to compare with marked as a horizontal broken line as well. As demonstrated here, Coachella Valley met federal 1 hour ozone standard. While Coachella Valley is approaching very close to the 1997 8-hour ozone standard, still it is well over 2015 ozone standard, which is the target of current AQMP. Next slide. So there are 4 in total federal ambient ozone standard as listed here. And then as mentioned in the previous slide, the current AQMP focus on the latest, which is 2015 8-hour ozone standard, and Coachella Valley is originally designated as a severe. Next slide. So before we going into the strategy, how to improve ozone air quality in Coachella Valley, we'd like to touch base on how the ozone phenomena in Coachella Valley is formed. And the primary reason is that the ozone in Coachella Valley is due to the transport from greater Los Angeles area, so-called South Coast Air Basin. So transport from South Coast Air Basin is primary reason for poor air quality in Coachella Valley. Next slide. What that means is the attainment of Coachella Valley's ozone air quality standard is tied with the improvement to be made in South Coast Air Basin. South Coast Air Basin is extreme non-attainment, of which attainment due is 2037. So our current AQMP analysis indicate that Coachella Valley's improvement depend on South Coast improvement. Therefore, the earliest the Coachella Valley can attain the standard is 2037, when the emission reductions to attain South Coast is in place, and South Coast is expected to attain. Coachella Valley is expected to attain as well. For that reason, South Coast AQMD is proposing so-called bumping up, so classification from severe to extreme level. Next slide. So with that general status of Coachella Valley's ozone, going back to a little bit of general discussion of ozone and AQMP wise. So the reason we are talking about ozone air quality is there is an adverse health effect associated with ozone, typically those are related with respiratory tract diseases, such as increased coughing, sore throat, making more susceptible to infection, increased asthma attack, etc. And then so pollutants that form ozone also forms particulate matter, which is known to cause premature death. Next slide. The primary way to improve ozone air quality in South Coast Air Basin, as well as in Coachella Valley, is to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxide. NOx is formed during fuel combustion process and fossil fuel. And the chart on the right indicates the level of NOx emissions expected current days, so 2018, and then future attainment due date under business as normal circumstances, and the goal to meet the 70 ppb standard. As shown in this graph, under business as usual condition, NOx emission is expected to decrease. That is thanks to the regulations already adopted and then continued implementing in future years. However, business as usual condition is not sufficient to meet 70 ppb standard, but 60 tons per day of NOx emission turns out to be the most amount of NOx emission we can accommodate while meeting the federal 70 ppb standard. Next slide. This pie chart indicates where NOx emissions coming from, why this is separating out emission sources from stationary area sources versus on-road and off-road mobile sources. First, you can notice that the majority of NOx emissions, specifically 80% of NOx emissions coming from mobile sources in 2018. When it comes to 2037, which is the due date to attain ozone standard, the portion of off-road sources increases substantially as shown on the pie chart on the right. Next slide. This leads to the question, who has authority to reduce emissions from specific sectors? In the previous slides, we noticed that off-road mobile sources have larger presence in the future years. And these off-road mobile sectors include sources such as ships, aircrafts, locomotives, and some of construction industrial equipment, etc. But then these specific sources happen to belong to federal authority to regulate. And when you add up the sources that belong to federal regulation, that amount is more than 60 tons, the maximum amount of NOx emissions we can accommodate while meeting the standard. So that is well presented or depicted in the bar chart in the left. So the federal sources exceed that allowed NOx emission amount, indicating that federal action to reduce their share of emission is critical to meet the standard. Next slide. And this indicates the amount of emission reductions proposed in this AQMP as well as CARB's state SIP strategy. So South Coast AQMD has the share of emission reductions. CARB also indicated their emission reductions under their direct authorities, and they're also expanding and then pursuing innovative approaches to pursue reductions from the sources they are under federal authority. So with all these proposed emission reductions, we're targeting to meet 60-ton level and then meeting the 70 ppb standard. Next slide. This amount of emission reduction is substantial and it is more challenging than ever. That indicating that innovative approaches are necessary to meet this level of emission reductions. Traditionally, air pollution control approaches relied on the reducing emissions from stacks and the vehicles by introducing cleaner fuels and cleaner technologies, etc. However, there are limits in these traditional approaches, and it turns out to be it is necessary to transit to the zero emission technology where it's feasible, and then when it is not, we need to rely on advanced cleaner technologies. Next slide. So with this target, the South Coast AQMD developed control strategies on how to achieve emission reductions. One, we have control measures that targeting directly NOx emission reductions. And then we also pursue so-called core benefits from the states or the local government's greenhouse gas reduction policies. We also have limited strategic VOC reduction strategies and other measures. Next slide. This slide presents a high-level overview of stationary and area source NOx control measures. We group them into three. That first, residential combustion that targets the fuel combustion sources in residential settings. And also we have the measures to pursue reductions from commercial buildings in their space heating, water heating, and other applications. And the last one is industrial large combustion. This is more like the traditional, the sources that are used to subject to air pollution control. That includes the promoting cleaner technology or even zero emission technology where feasible in the boilers, process heaters, refineries, or electric generating units. Next slide. While South Coast AQMD's primary regulatory authority lies in the stationary sources, we also proposed the emission reductions from mobile sources, and that can be grouped in few categories shown in this slide. The first one is facility-based mobile source measures, or sometimes it's called indirect source rules that targets reductions from airports, marine ports, rail yard, and warehouses. And also we have the measures that targeting or the pursuing emission reductions from emission growth measures by promoting cleaner the construction policies, etc. We also relies on incentive programs and promoting partnership with international and national authorities. Next slide. AQMP has been developed through public process. It has been ongoing already a couple of years using different venues as shown here, such as working group meetings, advisory group meetings, public workshops, and then also coordinating with other government and public agencies. Next slide. This is also showing where we are at with the AQMP. The first draft AQMP was released early May. We have received public comment letters, and those letters were incorporated, and then draft AQMP is revised as revised draft AQMP, which was released early September. Currently, and today is actually we are closing public comments. And in addition to that, CEQA component draft program EIR and the socioeconomic impact analysis report has been released. These two items will be presented in more detail in follow-up presentations. Items. Next one. So high-level summary of public comments that we received on draft AQMP is the general approach, why AQMP is needed, why we are doing this, how are we utilizing, and then how, and then identifying or the raising awareness on the federal action, the need for federal action. Also the concerns of utilizing black box measures. Next slide. Public comments also included the concerns on Z technology to be deployed in residential and commercial sectors, and then cost associated with the Z technology, and then infrastructure to support such zero emission technology, and then also equity. Next slide. Health effects analysis associated with the PM and ozone were included, and that is part of AQMP. It is more specific Appendix 1 of the AQMP. We formed advisory council, of which a specific task was to review this health effect associated with these pollutants. So far, 2 meetings has been held, and then this health effect analysis is under revision to reflect council's comments. Next slide. To assist the development AQMP, we developed 5 policy briefing papers as shown in this slide. All of them are available in AQMP website, of which address is given here. Next slide. So all these informations, including policy papers, briefing papers, responses to public comments submitted for the AQMP and steps responses to them, and the CEQA document and socioeconomic assessment, all those documents are available under 2022 AQMP, which address is given here. Next slide. There are different ways to reach to step to provide your feedback, and it is written on this slide. Next slide. So the next step we are preparing is, we will be revising the draft, to revise the AQMP once more to make a draft final, which is going to be released later next month. South Coast AQMD's governing board will consider adoption of the AQMP, and afterwards it will be submitted to CAR and eventually to US EPA for the inclusion into SIP. Next slide. This is follow-up of information, how to stay informed with the AQMP progress. With this, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sang-Mi. And I know that was a lot of dense content to try to get through. It can be a complicated document, but I appreciate we're trying to provide a high-level summary of a lot of really detailed analysis and engineering and consideration in this plan. So really do appreciate that overview, Sang-Mi. We still have more content to go, so we're just going to jump right to it. So I see we are really happy to have Sylvia Vandersbeck here from CARB to talk about CARB's SIP implementation plan, which is included as a key component of our air quality management plan. So Sylvia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian. So good morning, everyone. So I'm here to provide you some details regarding CARB's measure and emission reduction commitment that's included in the 22 AQMP. Next slide, please. Oops, okay, sorry. So before I focus on the South Coast and the Coachella, I just want to highlight quickly that, for this standard, there's, 19 non-attainment areas in California, 10 of them which need SIPs, and of those 7 areas need new emission reduction commitments. So the 2022 state SIP strategy provides the emission reduction commitments for all of it. And it also, addresses 3 of the only extreme areas in the country, South Coast, Coachella, and the San Joaquin Valley. Next slide. So last month, the California Air Resources Board approved the state measure commitments in the 2022 state SIP strategy. The strategy was developed through a robust public process and identifies the level of action needed to meet the air quality standards and protect public health throughout the state. This strategy will drive the pace and the scale of CARB's rulemaking through the end of this decade. And specific to the South Coast, the strategy identifies the actions the federal government needs to take to reduce emissions under their control, as discussed earlier by Sang-Mi. Next slide. So this figure here identifies the list of measures that CARB will be pursuing. Some of them have already been adopted, such as a clean mile standard that targets fleets like Uber and Lyft. Many are in the middle of the regulatory process. There are 2 regulations targeting trucks, the VAT Clean Fleet rules, which CARB will hear in a few weeks at our board meeting, one of the first meetings on it, and then a zero emission truck measure that will bring that fleet down to 0. New emission standards for motorcycle are being developed. And also CARB will be pursuing a suite of off-road measures, including a new off-road standard, zero emission requirements, and sources that operate, and also requirements for sources that operate in the ports. CARB's in-use locomotive regulation is innovative and significant and will provide significant emission reductions, not only in the South Coast, but also in the Coachella Valley. CARB is also ratcheting down on consumer products, and we're developing zero emission standards for space and water heaters. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the board approved the list of measures, and what goes along with the approval of the list of measures is also the schedule. So this slide here shows the aggressive board consideration schedule and implementation schedule for all of the measures that were that CARB will be taking as part of the 2022 State SIP strategy. Next slide, please. Oops. So as Sang Yi mentioned earlier, you know, emission reductions from our federal partners are key for the South Coast and the Coachella Valley to be able to attain the standard. While EPA is currently in the process of developing a low NOx standard, CARB still thinks that there's an opportunity to develop a zero emission truck standard also. For off-road, we think it's appropriate for them to also develop a Tier 5 standard, along with requiring zero emission where feasible. And CARB continues to push EPA to adopt more stringent locomotive standards and address locomotives after remanufacturing. For ocean-going vessels, we think there are opportunities for lower standards and cleaner fuels. And for aviation, we see there are opportunities from reductions from this sector. While these are going to be considered as black box actions, the measures actually clearly identify the path and the opportunities for EPA to take in order to implement these. Next slide, please. So as Sang Yi also mentioned, you know, the strategy focuses on NOx. So in the South Coast area, which definitely needs to be controlled in order for Coachella to meet the standard, CARB's commitment includes over 89 tons per day of NOx reductions and almost 14 tons per day of VOC reductions. Specific to the Coachella Valley, we're including a commitment of about 5 tons per day of NOx reductions. Of the reductions in the South Coast, almost 38 tons of the NOx and all of the VOC reductions come from the CARB-specific measures. And we're including these VOC measures to provide the near-term reduction. This is in addition to the 167 tons per day of reductions from CARB's existing control program, those part of Sang Yi's slides earlier. Again, federal sources need to be regulated in the South Coast for the region to have healthy air, and about 51 tons per day of the NOx reductions are assigned to federal sources, and where EPA will approve these as black box measures. Next slide, please. So next, on our next steps here, as I stated earlier, last month, CARB approved the measure commitments. Next, CARB's going to be approving the aggregate commitment, those numbers that I talked about just a few minutes ago. CARB will be approving that aggregate commitment along with the district's AQMP in January. Then we will submit it to US EPA for inclusion in the SIP. Throughout this process, though, CARB staff will continue to develop the measures listed in the previous slides and take them to the CARB board according to the schedule. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Appreciate you walking through all the things that CARB has put into the state strategy. And again, the AQMP relies heavily on that state strategy. So this partnership is really critical as we move forward. We're going to go ahead and keep moving now. There's a lot of measures that have been proposed of new control strategies on a whole variety of different sources that people have been hearing in the presentation so far. The next step to really talk about now is what are the potential impacts from implementing this plan. And so we're going to start off first talking about the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act analysis that we have conducted so far. And so Kevin, if I can have you go ahead and give a summary of what we're doing there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. So as Ian mentioned, I'll be giving an overview of the draft program environmental impact report prepared for the 2022 AQMP. Next slide, please. So the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, was adopted as California law in 1970. It is primarily an information disclosure document, both for decision makers and the public, to lay out the potential significant environmental impacts of a proposed project and to list feasible mitigation measures and alternatives. Next slide, please. The 2022 AQMP is a project subject to CEQA, and because it encompasses the actions that the South Coast AQMD will undertake in the next 4 years, it is evaluated under a program EIR. This is an overarching analysis of the rules, regulations, plans, and other projects, which will be individually evaluated in the future and will tier off this document. Next slide, please. So we previously finished the notice of preparation of an initial study, NOPIS, which is in the dark blue box and arrow to the left. We're currently in between the gold arrow and the light blue box, and South Coast AQMD has released its draft program EIR, and this document includes a more in-depth analysis of the environmental topics determined in the NOPIS to be potentially significant and includes a response to all comments received on the NOPIS. Once the public comment period ends on November 1st, we will work on the final program EIR, which will address any and all comments received on the draft program EIR and show any updates to the analysis. Finally, the governing board will be considering to certify the final program EIR. Next slide, please. So our draft program EIR follows the traditional structure with a short and sweet executive summary, followed by full-length discussions in chapters 2 through 5. For those who want an in-depth analysis, say on air quality, I would recommend you to first, read chapter 1, the executive summary, and then jump to chapter 4 to go more in depth on particular issues you might be interested in. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, the draft program EIR goes more into depth on the environmental topic areas that were previously analyzed in the NOPIS and determined to be potentially significant. The areas of air quality and greenhouse gases, energy, hazards and hazardous materials, hydrology and water quality, noise, and solid and hazardous waste, this is the bottom left box, were all determined to be potentially significant and are further evaluated. Also, the draft EIR includes 4 alternatives that were analyzed to be compared in comparison to the proposed project. Next slide, please. So overall, we expect long-term air quality and greenhouse gas emissions benefits through NOx and GHG reductions. On the path to get there, however, we do expect air quality impacts during construction of new control devices, more efficient technology and infrastructure, and short-term GHGs from producing like electricity and alternative fuels. Just going through the list, there are potential energy impacts due to electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen demand, potential hazards and hazardous materials impacts from ammonia use and fire hazards from coating reformulation, and going all the way down to even potential noise impacts from construction at roadways. Out of an abundance of caution, even after mitigation measures were identified, we did conclude that significant impacts would remain. Next slide, please. So the draft program EIR has been released for a 46-day public review period ending on November 1st. So if you would like to access the document, it is available online at the link on the 3rd bullet point on this slide, as well as via hard copy at the South Coast AQMD headquarters. Next slide, please. I will be the one compiling all the comments we receive on the draft program EIR. And this slide includes my contact information, including email and also a fax. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have all the contact information for the CEQA team as a whole, including my supervisor, as well as the other Assistant Deputy Executive Officer of our planning division. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate you walking through the high-level overview of our CEQA document. Next, we have another analysis document, which is really critical to the development of this plan. And this is our socioeconomic impact assessment, or socioeconomic report, that looks at both the potential health benefits from the plan, as well as the potential economic impacts, positive and adverse. So I'm going to turn this now to Elaine Shen, Dr. Elaine Shen, and so that she can walk through a summary of this report. So go for it, Elaine.
All right, thank you, Ian. Good evening, everybody. My name is Elaine Shen. I'm Planning and Rules Manager, overseeing the preparation of our socioeconomic report for our 2022 AQMP Air Quality Management Plan. Next slide, please. Just by way of background, so we have prepared the socioeconomic impact assessment for AQMP since 1991, so over 3 decades already. And even though this document is not legally required, unlike our rules that would require socioeconomic impact analysis, we still prepare this assessment for every round of AQMP in order to better inform the members of the public and also our policymakers, including our governing board members. And in this report, similar to the CEQA document, we also have an executive summary where we present the major findings of our analysis. And in each of the following chapters, then we take a deeper dive into different topics. And at the end, we also include technical appendices in order to present the technical details for the readers and stakeholders who are interested in understanding more about how the analysis was conducted. Next slide, please. All right, so we released our draft socioeconomic report on the revised draft 2022 AQMP on October 1st. And so since then, it's been open for public comments and will be closing the public comment period on November 2nd. And in this report, we analyze, as Ian mentioned earlier, the health benefits, the associated costs of implementing these control measures, as well as the macroeconomic, including jobs, and the environmental justice impact associated with implementing our revised draft 2022 AQMP. And on this slide, you will also find that the hyperlink to access all the documents that we have published since then. And so if you click into the hyperlink, you will see what's shown here on the little rectangle box. And so there's a link to our main report, another link to our technical appendices, and critically, another link at the bottom of that rectangle box, where you will find a link to submit the public comments. And if you would like to submit your public comments directly to us as a PDF or individual file, you're also welcome to submit that directly to our socioecon at AQMD.gov email address. Next slide, please. And so since the beginning of the socioeconomic report preparation, we have continued to engage and involve our stakeholders via our public processes. And so since November last year up to this month, we have conducted 4 scientific, technical, and modeling peer review advisory group meetings where we discuss the socioeconomic topics. And so this is in addition to the STM PR meetings that we conducted for air quality modeling. And at the same time, we also had 3 scoping sessions that we held back in May at our regional public workshops. And so including today, we'll have 5 meetings in total this month. That's our regional public hearings that we are presenting our socioeconomic report findings. And on October 7th, about a week after we released the draft socioeconomic report, we also had a presentation to our South Coast AQMD governing board, and where the members of the public, our stakeholders, also had a chance to comment on that presentation. Next slide, please. And so from this slide onwards, I will be presenting the major findings of our report. And in terms of the incremental costs, all the costs associated with implementing our 2022 AQMP, And this table here, you could see that the total annualized incremental cost is about 2.85 billion per year. And about close to 57% of this annualized average is associated with implementing the mobile source control measures included in this 2022 AQMP, with the remainder associated with stationary and also area source control measures. And about 10% of them are related to the proposed control measures that are incentive-based and that are potentially would be funded with public money in order to reduce the burdens to the regulated communities. Next slide, please. And on this slide, I want to provide you with the more detailed breakdown regarding the 2.85 billion annual cost that we just discussed, and also their associated emission reductions that we're projecting for year 2037 that would be critical for our regional air quality attainment. And so you can see on the pie chart on the left-hand side, about 50%, close to 50% of that 2.85 billion annual cost are associated with the mobile source control measures that are proposed by CARB to be implemented by CARB directly, or they are proposed for federal government to take further actions in order to reduce emissions from the mobile sources. So it's discussed before by both Semi and also Sylvia. Those will be related to OGVs, ocean-going vessels, aviation, airplanes, and things like that. And on this slide, you also see that about 75% of that 2037 projected NOx reductions will be associated with these mobile source control measures, either by CARB or as part of federal action. And on the flip side of that is that you can see for stationary source and also area source control measures, they are relatively more expensive. That would result in a little bit less emission reductions when compared to those mobile source measures. And the reason why you see this sort of disproportionate cost versus NOx reduction among all these different control measures is just largely due to the fact that a lot of these stationary source control measures, they are already tightly regulated. And since we're pursuing all feasible control measures as part of the AQMP, and that's also legally required for us to do so, that we will need to pursue zero emission technologies wherever feasible in order to reduce further the emissions from these sources. And as of today, the zero emission technologies that will be applicable for this kind of like industrial, commercial, and also high energy demand kind of sources, they are still relatively more expensive when compared to the traditional combustion-based technologies, again, as of today. Next slide, please. And compared to that 2.85 billion of incremental costs per year that we just discussed, we also quantify the monetized public health benefits that would be as a result of implementing our 2022 AQMP. So on an annual average, we're projecting close to $20 billion per year of the monetized health benefits that would be realized within our region. And about 74% of those benefits, they are associated with the reductions in long-term exposure to fine particulate matter, or PM2.5. And there's also a substantial portion that's related to the reduction in long-term exposure to ozone pollution. And with the remainder of the benefits associated with all the mobility-related benefits, such as reduced asthma attack, reduced asthma onset, and also other diseases that are associated with air pollution, and also including endpoints like avoided work loss days, school loss days, etc. Next slide, please. And on this slide, I want to take a deeper dive into the majority of that monetized health benefits, excuse me, that associated with the avoided premature deaths. And so on the left-hand side, you will see two maps that give you the kind of special distribution of the health benefits that we can expect throughout the region. And on the right-hand side, it's a more tabular format where you can see the numbers that we estimated in terms of how many cases of avoided premature deaths for different regions and associated with different pollutants. And so you will see that by year 2037, we're projecting about 3,000 cases of avoided premature deaths that can be realized by implementing those pollution cutting control measures. And how these different health effects are being projected, they're associated with three key factors. So the first factor is where we project where the pollution reductions will be taking place. But it's also tightly related to the size of population, how they are distributed across the region. So in more densely populated region, we'll be expecting more health benefits associated with reduced health risk for each individual. And it's also very much associated with where the most vulnerable and susceptible populations are located within our region. Next slide, please. Yep. And in order to also make sure that the monetized health benefits and also the associated health effects, they are equitably distributed among the EJ communities and non-EJ communities, we conducted an environmental justice analysis looking at the different outcomes within the EJ communities and also within the non-EJ communities. And on this slide, I'm going to give the example of the avoided premature deaths. And again, that's the health outcome that would account for that majority of the monetized health benefits. And so in order to define which communities are environmental justice or EJ communities, we look at different potential definitions to designate these communities. And so the main definition that we rely on is consistent with Senate Bill 535, how they define the disadvantaged communities. And in order to check to have the sensitivity analysis as well, we also look at two other alternative definitions where we put a little bit more weight towards the air quality associated EJ indicators. And as you can see on this table is that it does not really matter which definition we use to define the EJ communities. We see in general, like the finding is that there would be more health benefits accrue to EJ communities than the non-EJ communities. And the EJ communities are those that are disproportionately more impacted by environmental burdens, including air pollution. Next slide, please. And as part of this report, we also analyzed the potential job impacts related to the annual costs that we discussed earlier, that's shown on the blue bars here on this chart, and as well as the potential job impacts related to the health benefits that can be realized by implementing different control measures, and that are shown on the green bar here. And the purple dash curves that you see on this slide that shows the net benefits or net job impacts when we combine the costs and also the health benefits together. So on an annual average, we're projecting about 17,000 jobs foregone. And that's in an economy where we have on average over 10 million jobs on an annual basis through our region. And even though we're projecting that the jobs foregone will result in a slight slowdown of the annual job growth for our economy between year 2023 and year 2037. But then overall, we're still projecting a positive job growth trajectory for our region. Next slide, please. And so for the next steps for our AQMP socioeconomic report, as we discussed earlier, we released the report on October 1st. So it's been open for public comments since then. And that would be ending on November 2nd. So we encourage everybody to submit your suggestions, comments, or if you have any questions, please reach out to us or use the public comment submission form that we shown on an earlier slide. And so this month, we are conducting these 5 different regional public hearings. And then in mid-November, we would be taking into account all the comments that we have received from you, including from these regional public hearings, and also from the public comments that were submitted to us in writing. And we'll take into account all of those into our next version of the release. And that will also include a section where we would have our staff responses to all the comments submitted. And on December 2nd, we plan to take the whole 2022 AQMP package, including the draft final socioeconomic report, to our governing board for our public hearing. Next slide, please. And if you have any comments or questions on our draft socioeconomic report for 2022 AQMP, please feel free to reach out to Brian Volosich, who is on my staff in the socioeconomic analysis unit, or reach out to myself directly. And for any general AQMP questions and inquiries, please reach out to Dr. Sammy Lee, who presented earlier, or reach out to Ian McMillan, who is our Assistant Deputy Executive Officer. And again, like if you want to access our documents, we have the hyperlink listed again here on this slide, or you can email us at socioecon@aqmd.gov. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to all our speakers. I know we got through a whole lot of content up there over the last 45 minutes to an hour. Thank you, everyone who's attending, for having patience and listening to all the detailed analysis that's been conducted. So now we turn it over to you, those in the public. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, any thoughts you'd like to share, now is a good time to go ahead and raise your hand in the Zoom, and we'd like to hear your questions or comments. And if you think of something afterwards and you say, well, you know what, that really sparked an idea, and then later on you want to come back to us, you saw that there's a lot of contact information for staff that was shown on all the slides, and definitely encourage any follow-up that you would like to do. Please do that as well. So right now I'm going to go ahead and open it up. I see we have a couple hands raised in the audience. So the first hand raised, Maria Reyes, did you have a question or comment that you would like to make? And Maria, I think you have to unmute on your end. We've opened it up for you.
Oh, sí, hola, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Yo creo que tenía la manita levantada por accidente.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Let's go. Oops, there we go. Okay, so the next hand up, Mark Abramowitz. Do you have a comment you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. And like I've done at the other hearings, I'm taking a different topic and going to be addressing it through this public hearing process. And before I get going, I just want to make sure that all the information gets incorporated into the record. And if it's not already there, I'd like to ask and have incorporated by reference the recordings and notes that the district has regarding all the workshops and working group meetings, as well as the presentations on this AQMP process that have gone to the governing board. And that should incorporate a lot of my previous comments. Today, I want to talk about new source review and implementation of the plan. And the district has the technology to implement and meet standards, but it's where the execution and the policy decisions kind of fall down. You know, new source review is a great example. It was 40 years ago in 2 months that I first testified before the South Coast Board on new source review. And I can say that rule that was adopted by that board is actually stronger in many ways than the current one. The district has made a number of policy decisions and has determined that it's too difficult to find offsets or for companies to find offsets. And rather than focus on the real beginnings of the Clean Air Act, which actually tried to ensure that new sources don't get in the way of achieving air quality standards, the district has kind of given up. And I've had a number of clients with new technologies that have basically had to leave their new technologies because of district's implementation of air quality standards and new source review requirements. It's the failure by the district to rely on that process and come up with ways in which the district could actually get that program to work. You know, the district in its response comments to me said that SB 288 prevented the district from doing more. And I think that that's kind of ridiculous, because strengthening new source review should not make it weaker. Many suggestions have been given to district staff about how to make that program stronger. And frankly, if you achieve some sort of consensus, SB 288 does not have an adverse impact. Well, I'm out of my time, so next time.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate those comments. And as you know, there's a NSR discussion specifically to dive into a lot of those details there. So really appreciate your comments here and your engagement on that other forum as well. Want to open this up to any other commenters or any other anybody else who wants to make any comment here. So I'm going to just pause a little bit and give anybody an opportunity. Again, if you wanted to raise your hand, you could do that on the Zoom screen down at the bottom and click on the raise hand button, and then we can call on you. So I'm just going to pause here, see if there are any questions. Not seeing anybody raising their hand now. We can do interpretation as well in case there are any Spanish speakers who would like to make any comment. We do have an interpreter here. Okay, so I don't see anybody raising their hand. So I think with that, we can go ahead and conclude tonight's meeting. Definitely appreciate everybody joining us today. We have 2 more regional hearings that we'll be doing later this week. One focused on Orange County, another focused on Riverside County, both at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So again, thank you everybody for participating tonight. Thank you to all the speakers and all the staff who prepared all the materials and prepared the meeting itself. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude tonight's meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.